Okay. Well, hi, everybody. My name is Ariel Whiteley Knoll. I am the communications coordinator for the Kansas Forest Service. And I'm so excited to have you all here for our very first Kansas Forest Service book club. We're really excited today to talk about Doug Tallamy's book, The Nature of Oaks. I hope you all had a chance to read it. But we'll also have our guest speaker be Ryan Armbruster, who is our rural forestry program coordinator. Really excited to have Ryan talk to us. And you will find that he is very passionate about oaks. When I proposed this idea to Ryan, I think I said, do you want to talk about oak? And then he was like, yep, I didn't even get the full word out. So we're both really, really excited to have you all here today. I just wanted to go over a little bit about how today's going to go, and then I don't want to spend any more time on that. I'll kick it over to Ryan. We are going to start with Ryan talking a little bit about his experience with oak trees in Kansas and the types of oak trees that our experience has shown us do really well here, and touch on some of his favorite parts about the book as well. As Ryan is talking, if you have any questions, please feel free to kick those over into the chat. When he's done, we're only going to have time for maybe one or two questions specifically for Ryan, because then I want to get to the meat of our discussion and talk about the book itself. So for the book itself, I have prepared several discussion questions. I know several of you on this Zoom, so I have a feeling like 2 or 3 questions is probably all we're going to get through, just because I'm sure the discussion is going to be really hearty. So with the discussion, if you feel more comfortable putting your comments in the chat, that's totally great. If you do want to unmute and turn your video on and talk to all of us, that's wonderful too. The only thing I would ask is there will be several of us on today, so just leaving space for other people to have answers. If you answer one question, maybe consider waiting on the next couple questions just to let everybody. I'm kind of one of those like really fast thinkers, but sometimes people want to take a little bit of time and mull things over. And then when we're done with that, if you guys have more questions for Ryan or you want to stick around and talk for a little bit longer, we are happy to do that as well. So without further delay, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Ryan and hear about all his love and passion for oak trees.
That's true. Thanks, Ariel. And yeah, that's pretty accurate. I do. So I love books and I love oaks. I don't know that I've ever been in a book club before. I read a lot of books and love telling people about what I learned out of them. So I guess when Ariel proposed this idea, I thought, yeah, that could be fun. Then she said, let's talk about oaks. I'm like, yeah, I'm definitely in. Especially, so I've got the book here. If I can hold it in the right spot where the background doesn't go through. So I heard Doug Tallamy talk years ago. So full disclosure, I'm originally from Nebraska. I'm not a born native Kansan. I hope you still let me in the group here. But I'm a child of the Great Plains, so I think we can all get along. But I was in Nebraska about 12 or 14 years ago, and Doug Tallamy was doing a speaking tour about his book at that time, which was Bringing Nature Home, which is a great book to recommend that if you want to talk about, pollinator support, backyard edible landscaping, all that kind of stuff, the importance of having native trees and native, plant material that helps support our food web. But I thought, man, this guy gets it. That's pretty cool. Even if he's from Delaware, like he gets it. This is important across the country. So yeah, this was an easy one for me to jump on board with. I think the cool thing about what Doug does in this book is that he tries to tell us what's important to him, how oaks matter to him, and he tells it through the story of insects, because he's an entomologist, right? He's been an entomologist for 4 or 5 decades, and that's how it really comes home for him. And I think a lot of us, well, at least me especially, I think about how oaks are important to me in a little bit of a different lens. Not to say that anything you wrote in the book doesn't resonate with me, it really does. But I grew up on a farm in eastern Nebraska, and we had a lot of bur oaks and some black walnuts sort of in the hills and the pasture land, sort of like a bur oak savanna. And I remember from the youngest age going out there and running around like you do unsupervised and picking up acorns and throwing them at my brothers, because that's what you do when you got brothers, you throw acorns at each other, climbing that tree and hanging out there. And so for the longest time, I thought, I guess my background with trees, I've told this story for years, I guess, isn't just trees, but specifically like that bur oak, like that in my mind was the archetypal tree of all trees when I was growing up. And I go back there now, my dad still farms there, and I know it has literally gotten smaller, but man, that tree is a lot smaller now. That tree was 900 feet tall when I was little, and now it's only like 50 feet tall. I don't know what happened. I must have, something must have happened here, but it was a massive tree when I was little, and now it's just a pretty normal sized bur oak. But that was the tree that kind of caught me on and thinking all the stuff that's associated around that tree. We'd have cattle standing under that tree. We'd have see all kinds of birds in that. So for me, when I think about oaks, I think about bur oaks, and I think about that tree, and I think about bur oak savannas, which are such a cool thing. So, right, we're in the Great Plains, but the cool thing about the Great Plains is it's not like a homogeneous system, right? We've got all this cool mosaic of different types of grassland, rangeland, riparian forests, and bur oak savannas, and Chinkapin oak, draws and gallery forests in the Flint Hills here, where I live. But it's this really cool dynamic system where you have all these different margins and edges and this mosaic pattern that goes back and forth. And you see oaks all across that. I think one of the first things that I was just floored by after I moved to Kansas was the first time I was down the Cross Timbers. I don't know if anyone in the group here has had opportunity to really walk around through some of the Cross Timbers forest type in southeast, south central Kansas. Just amazing. The post oak and the blackjack oak down there on these rocky outcroppings and hills as it radiates out into these different, grassland systems. But it's so much fun to walk around that. So we have these oaks and forest types at the edge, sort of this interplay, these ecotones, between different systems all over the state and all over the Great Plains. So I thought that was super cool. And thinking about how that if you're a hunter, you often know you hunt the edges and margins, right? So those transition areas where you have a lot of wildlife that's supported there, both game and non-game wildlife. But that's where we find the life, these transition periods, and oaks are really good at that. I remember reading a book years ago that talked about how oaks don't really specialize. They're not the best at anything. They're not the strongest wood. They're not the fastest growers. They're not the oldest trees. But man, they're just really pretty good at a lot of things. They're really good at being adapted. They're really good at sort of hybridizing with other oaks to sort of fit in. They're not the most fire resistant tree out there, but a lot of them are very well fire adapted, especially bur oaks. I think we're probably well aware of that, especially here in the Great Plains where we have a big fire, history, fire adapted climate. We see these bur oaks with this chunky bark that insulates them from these ephemeral fires that sweep through real quickly. They're good at resprouting. It's just I think as I reflect back on my eyes being open to oaks as a young boy more years ago now than I probably care to admit, as I see myself in the Zoom here with more gray hair than I thought I had. Oaks were the first tree that really opened me to there's more going on out here, right? Trees into trees into tree. It's part of this dynamic system. It's a as Doug Tallamy talks about in the book, it's a keystone species that everything else kind of spins off of. And it's fun to start to slow down and look at that and see how this fits into that whole system. But again, it's not just bur oaks. One of the coolest things I think that we've got in our area here in sort of northern Flint Hills up into southeast Nebraska is a species that, I've got a soft spot in my heart for, the dwarf Chinkapin oak, or Quercus prinoides. I don't think a lot of folks realize how special a tree that is. We've got this interesting pocket. If you look at it like a North American range map of oaks, which is something that if you're a tree nerd like me, you look at North American range maps of oaks. We've got this island of dwarf Chinkapin oak out here in the northern Flint Hills and just into southeast Nebraska, right across the border. It's really unique, and they're super well adapted to these really thin soils, these alkaline soils we've got. And they're a really neat tree, and they're something that I wish we saw more of in the nursery trade, actually, because you look at a small landscape size oak, something that's going to be 10 to 15, 20 feet tall, maybe at maturity, can grow in horrible compacted and thin soils. That sounds like urban soils in a lot of times, right? And it produces acorns at a young age, has a ton of wildlife benefit. I'd love to see those grow more all over the place. So if you're ever out and about and you see one of these dwarf Chinkapin oaks growing on some of these thin soils and these rocky knobs in the Flint Hills, about mid-September, the acorns are falling off that. Put a few of those acorns in your pocket, bring them home, plant them. I think you're going to be really pleased with what you get there. We've got a few in our demonstration arboretum here at the Forest Service in Manhattan, which also, please, if you're through Manhattan, come by our state office headquarters here. We've got a huge, not a huge arboretum, but a huge diversity of plants here behind our office. We've got over 100 woody species here, including 30 different species of oaks. And we've got some dwarf Chinkapin oaks and others out here. But there's a row of about 5 or 6 dwarf Chinkapin oaks I planted from seed. And this is the really cool thing when you plant stuff from seed, right? You get this amazing diversity. So every one of those looks different leaf shaped, a little bit different leaf color. Some are a little bit smaller, some have more waxy leaf to it. Some are a little bit more upright. Some are really shrubby looking, almost like a viburnum. So I guess moral of the story there is pick up acorns, put them in your pocket, do what I call a squirrel impression. Pick up acorns, put them in your pocket, take them home and plant them. You're going to get cool stuff. And there's probably an oak for any landscape out there too. But I haven't met a landscape yet that can't fit a dwarf chinkapin oak into it because they're nice and small and compact. So I realize I'm kind of rambling here, right? But I just think oaks are really cool. And there was a lot of stuff that I found in the book that sort of tagged for me some sort of mental imagery recollection of how I think oaks are an important part of our landscape. And I guess one of the things that I've talked about a lot when we talk about why is it important to slow down and look at what's around us is that if you don't know what you're looking at and don't have a concept of what you're seeing, you can't really value it, right? And that's something that even in the prologue of Ptolemy's book, I wrote down a few quotes here that he had. And he says, how can we be interested in or understand the ecological significance of something we know nothing about? And I think we still do that often. It's easy to just look at, trees are trees. I see Kevin just put in the chat, please, we'll get you some dwarf chinkapin acorns. We think of trees as trees. And when we slow down, don't just look at everything that's green as just an interchangeable tree. We miss so much. And I think, Doug explores that in his book through this lens of the deeper you go down into let's look at the birds and then let's look at what the birds eat. And then let's look at what those things that the birds eat are consuming. And then let's even go dig around the leaf litter below the trees and see what's there. There's this whole giant system that, often we miss. But I think it's pretty cool to dig into. But we can't understand how important these things are unless we start to learn something about it. And I think his book is aimed a little bit at someone who's got some basic knowledge about ecosystems, ecology, perhaps botany or entomology. He throws around a few $10 words in there. But I think it's pretty accessible. I would hope even to just the general public in terms of helping lay some groundwork for there's a giant system here. And just as an example, this one particular genus of trees is a really important hub at the center of this whole system. And we miss that. And that gets pulled out of our system either through some cases, landscape conversion or just, choices we make when we decide what tree we're going to buy at the nursery to put in our front yard. We don't realize the sort of cascading impact that can have. For years, we talked about the impact of if you put a tree in your front yard, if you choose a calorie pear, it probably has no positive impact, right? It's basically a food desert. There's no insects it supports. It has obviously quite a few negative impacts and the seedlings it'll throw all over the place and threaten adjacent lands. That's a huge problem for us. We're seeing blow up in Kansas, the calorie pear invasion of rangelands and other lands. But if you'd made a different choice, right? If you put an oak in your front yard instead, and that's not to, say that other tree species like willows or birches or maples have no value, but man, if you choose an oak in some cases, think of all the massive benefits that can have. I think that's pretty cool to think of the cascading effect we can have there. I think at one point in his book, he talks about, let me pull this too, that, what they found was in cities, I want to get this statistic right so I don't mislead you because you guys have all probably read the book and will call me out on this. But they found, that in communities, we can support breeding bird populations essentially indefinitely, as long as at least 70% of the plants in our yards are native species. And oaks are a keystone one for doing that. And I just filled my bird feeders in my house yesterday with sunflower seeds, which is always fun for me and my family to watch the birds that show up. But I think even more important than what I did there was a few years back, I planted a white oak in my front yard, and it's not old enough to do much yet. It's only about 15 feet tall, but that is probably going to do way more, have way more benefit for the birds in my community and all the other insects and everything else that spins off of that than if I bought thousands of pounds of sunflower seeds and fed them through the winter every year. Plus, it's a lot cheaper to just plant one tree. But I guess one of the things that I wanted to talk about too is that, I think there's this phenomenon I've seen, and it doesn't matter what state you're in, the Great Plains, where wherever you're at, I think there's a popular perception that oak trees grow slow, or that you can maybe grow them somewhere about 50 miles east of here, but wherever I happen to sit, I'm too far west to grow an oak tree. And I've heard people in Leavenworth tell me that, and I've heard people in Colby tell me that, and everywhere in between, that where they sit, if you just go east a little ways, you could probably grow them, but it's too tough here. And I honestly haven't found that to be the case. I've seen some pretty awesome oak trees and a lot of other trees growing in places that, the common perception would be now they won't grow here. But something an old professor of mine used to always say was, not all the trees read the textbook. Trees are going to surprise you. Some of them are going to die when they're supposed to live. Quite a few of them are going to live when they're supposed to die. I think a great example of that actually is there are some oak trees from, I would call them sort of Mississippi oaks that are south and east of here. We planted the Great Plains that, boy, they do a lot better than you think they ought. Cherry bark oak or Quercus pagoda or pagodafolia, depending on what book you want to look at. But cherry bark oak, that's a Mississippi Delta oak tree, and maybe northern Mississippi, really shouldn't grow well. I've seen those grow extremely well up into central Nebraska. Why? I don't know. Nobody told the tree it wasn't supposed to grow. I think that's the case with a lot of this. English oak, like, I'm all for native oaks, don't get me wrong, but English oak has got no business growing in the Great Plains, especially the Western Great Plains. And I've seen English oak do really well from Scottsbluff, Nebraska to, I see Chris Austin out in Dodge. I see you on the call here. I don't know if you've got any English oak out there, but that's something you could potentially grow. And that's a crazy tree to try and grow in Western Kansas, but we've seen it do well. I'll just pause here for a second. Chris, maybe since I called you out, do you have any English oak growing out in Dodge?
So actually, I was just looking on my phone because there is a former state champion in Kinsley, which is just like 20 miles east of us. And every year I go over there and collect acorns. The last two has been dismal. I haven't had hardly any acorns, but I personally, working for the city, I have planted somewhere between 15 and 30 that I have started from acorn off of that tree in our city parks. So, and right now, the ones that I did about 5 years ago are pushing about 6 to 8 feet tall. And that's from acorn about 5 years ago, probably.
Awesome. That's perfect, Chris. You set me up to look a lot smarter than I really am there.
Yeah.
Appreciate that.
Yeah, so it's working.
Yeah. So it surprises you. I mean, try stuff and learn from it. And I think especially with oaks, try them when they're small, because it's going to be better physiologically for that tree, because you're not subjecting an oak tree, which predominantly wants to focus growth on its roots in the first few years. You're not subjecting that to nursery practices, which it's not just well adapted for. And it's going to be cheaper to grow it from small trees and acorns, and you're going to learn stuff. There's about 90 species of oak trees native to the United States. Some of those are going to grow well for you. We've got oak trees that are native to every state. Some of those that even aren't native to your state are probably going to do well for you. So we've actually got, I think, probably quite a big palette of trees that we can try across the state of Kansas. And I realized we could talk about, the banana belt of Southeast Kansas, where, except for this year, in a normal year, they get 45 inches of rain, right? They only got like 20, 22 inches of rain this year, which is, pretty tough on a lot of the trees down there, to be honest. But you go from 45 inches of rain up to western part of the state where, you might get 10 to 12 to 14 inches of rain. And sometimes that occurs 3 inches at a time and doesn't do a whole lot for you. But there's going to be an oak that's probably well adapted for wherever you are, but you won't find out until you try and learn. And what we're learning is that, these oaks, even if you just get a few of them, they have this cascading ripple effect that positive benefits for entire food web outside of it. And that's not even talking about all the ecosystem benefits it can have in terms of, just community forestry, canopy, interception of pollutants with shading, with stormwater interception. And we're not even, touching on the fact that these things are just nice for us to have in our communities surrounding us. There's a lot of places that I was just talking to a guy today that says, well, we're in Western Kansas, all we can grow is Siberian elm. I said, well, that may not be the case. I think we do have more options than that. And if you're going to try some things, let's try and pull from a palette of oaks, because they're going to be, when they do succeed, extremely long-lived. And, you could delve a long ways down the rabbit hole of long-term ecosystem benefits, including long-term carbon sequestration that we're going to have in our communities and our rural forests as well, from including oaks and managing for oaks. So I don't know if I've been talking too long now, Ariel, if we just need to go ahead and transition,
No.
but clearly I'd love to talk about oaks and the need for diversity and try stuff for a long time. So please, if anything I just rambled on and said sort of triggers something, please send me a follow-up email. I'm sure either at some point in this call or somewhere else we'll have contact information, or they said my point the right way, our website, you can find our contact information on. To follow up with me. I love talking oaks. I love helping people find good solutions to, problems that can be solved by trees.
Thank you, Ryan. That's great. And I will make sure to include some resources at the end. So you guys will have all those links, and then I'll send that out in the follow-up email as well. I didn't see any questions in the chat before we kind of segue into fully talking about the book. Does anybody have any questions for Ryan specifically? If not, that's okay. You might need a little bit
I
of
did
time.
see one. So there's one in there that's just talking about if dwarf chinkapin oak is different from chinkapin oak.
Yes.
Right. So here's the problem. So I like scientific names. Common names are fun because they're often really evocative, right? So something like cherry bark oak is a really evocative name for me. Cherry bark oak, you could think of, something about that tree as opposed to just, the very dry Quercus pagodifolia. But sometimes it leads to confusion, right? So what's the difference between chinkapin oak and dwarf chinkapin oak? Is one just smaller than the other? Well, yes, it's smaller, but they're different species, right? And if you start to get out and walk through the woodlands where these two things grow together, you will see some hybrid integration there, where you do have a few that, is it mostly this or that that'll occur? But they are distinct species. So dwarf chinkapin oak is Quercus crinoides, and whereas chinkapin oak is Quercus muhlenbergii. And if you could spell muhlenbergii without looking it up, then gold star to you. But they are different species. They do co-occur in a lot of the same places. They both like, thinner soils. They tolerate alkaline soils a little bit better than some other species do. But they're different species. And if you're an acorn picker like me, you'll start to notice that right away. Dwarf chinkapin oak, somewhat surprisingly, actually has a slightly larger acorn, about the size of I would say it's about half an inch long or so, whereas chinkapin oak is actually a little bit smaller acorn, almost the size of like a pin oak acorn, if you're familiar with that size. So different acorn sizes, a little bit different acorn maturation time as well, and distinctly different growth habits. The dwarf chinkapin oak tends to be multi-stemmed, tends to be strongly grow back from roots, so very, very fire adapted. You have a fire come through there, if you get some top growth killed back, that dwarf chinkapin oak is going to come back from roots very strongly. It's not going to be something like wild plums that's grown back from suckers all over the place and is aggressive, but it's extremely fire adapted, even more so than chinkapin oak is.
That's great. And I just want to point out that while Ariel Googled those scientific names and pasted them into the chat, Ryan knew the scientific names and pronounced them correctly. So just a couple of differences I would like to point out for everybody. We did have a question for Mary, and I know we actually have a couple of people representing municipalities on the call. So this might be a group question, but just talking about conserving we talk about how old these trees can become, but often in our urban landscapes, that's not their fate. So how do we preserve 10, 20, 60, 70-year-old oak trees so that they can become these sort of giants in our ecosystem, recognizing the challenges whenever nature and people come together? And I'll just have that be.
I'm going to go ahead and let the group answer, but if no one has anything to say, I'll let an awkward pause pass, and then I've got a couple thoughts, but I would love to hear from some of the folks on the group.
So I'm the one that posed the question, and the neighborhood that I'm in really focused on oaks back in the 1960s. So there's a huge number of pin oaks, a lot of bur oaks, and then recently they've added a lot of sawtooth oaks. So we've really got a strong oak population in our neighborhood. But recently, various places have come through and cut down some very substantial trees. Now they did have what I would have called the warning sign, the conch on the bottom of it, but not any massive deterioration. And I've seen them go through, and I think we've lost probably 10 or 12 of these substantial 60, 70, 80-year-old oaks. And from what Doug Talamay says, those ought not go away. Keep them pruned up. I mean, keep the limbs that are going to fall on a car off, but don't take them out. So I was just wondering, how can we get our municipalities and our parks departments to start to look at the oaks in a different fashion?
So yeah, I'll let a pause here if anyone else wants to jump in, but unsurprisingly, I've got thoughts.
I can't speak for your municipality, but I can tell you, Southwest Kansas, I'm landscape and ground superintendent, and I'm acting city forester. Before us, foresters before me were heavily into the bur oaks. And so those of you who don't know, I'm from Dodge City, so we're very minimal water. Literally the bur oaks was all they planted for years and years and years, if they planted oaks at all. My current director and I, he's a K-State graduate, and we both grew up here. We are extreme oak planters. The first thing when someone asks us, what do you recommend? We say oak. Go to any oak you can find, plant it. We unfortunately don't have the same problem that you do. We don't really have any 60-year-old oaks here. If we do, they're in residential areas. There's nothing in the park area. Now, we'll probably have some 30 to 40-year-old ones, and they're very few and far between. As far as your place cutting them down, as I've heard multiple times, every tree has imperfections, but not every tree is a hazardous tree. So for us, when we're evaluating a tree, if the hazard outweighs where it's at, we have to remove it. So I can't speak for where your community is removing these trees, but we have to make that decision when it comes to parks, when it comes to easements, when it comes to place sets, parking lots, anything that we have to make recommendations on. I'm very fast to tell people your tree's probably going to fail in the next 10 to 20 years, so you need to underplant it. Don't cut it down now. Prune it up, clean it up, prepare for it to be lost years from now. And maybe that's a conversation that you could have with your parks department is find out what their underplanting program is, and maybe that's something that you could help get the Boy Scouts involved, get the Girl Scouts involved, get community places involved, and your school districts involved, and have them help provide us with the manpower, because that's the other thing we're lacking. For a place we're trying to plant 100 trees a year, I have at the time I have one person. So if we're watering oaks for 3 to 5 years and I'm planting 100 of them, that's 300 trees that one person needs to be out watering. So as far as cutting them down, I think I would start with the how are you planning on underplanting, and maybe that would open up the conversation, and then you could test the water of, okay, now that we're discussing this, how do we keep you from cutting them down and just cleaning them up instead of removing them?
That's great.
Hey, Ariel.
Hi, Kevin.
Well, us master gardeners, our kind of first commandment is always right plant in the right place, right? So, I mean, that could be a factor, the plant selection, site, location, those are things that I hope that are being considered. But as far as trees that need to come out, I just attended a really good urban tree workshop that Kim Baumberger did back in November here at Topeka. And she had some really good information in there about how to identify trees that were a problem and maybe were ones that were in need of attention or removal. So I don't know if any of that was archived or anything, but that was, I thought, we had a lot of people that attended that were from the county and city, parks and forestry. And I think that that was all information that they really appreciated and found useful.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so one thing sorry, go ahead, Ariel, go ahead.
I was just going to say, thanks for bringing that up, Kevin. What he's referencing is that all of our community foresters held workshops across the state in November, and they were meeting specifically with municipalities. That was their goal. And it was to look at a tree canopy study that Kansas Forest Service did, but also to talk about some of those things that Kevin mentioned. So that's something that our community foresters are very invested in, working with what we realize are limited staffing. I mean, nobody's having good luck hiring right now. Very stretched, thin departments to prioritize, because the reality is they can't take care of every tree in their communities, but safety's got to be number one. And so looking at those hazard trees is a really big part of that.
Well, and
Yep.
maybe, I don't know where you live, but find out who that your community forester is and have a chat with them, and then maybe they can have a little meetup with your local parks folks and, kind of help put them on the right track.
Yeah. So the other dimension of this I think it's important to focus on too is that I'm just going to assume, just for the sake of argument too, that these trees probably did need to be removed. That maybe you had tree risk, hazard, track qualified people saying this is a hazard and these trees do need to come out. But I think we have an opportunity here to sort of shift about how we think about these trees as well. In an ideal world, yeah, oaks are going to live hundreds of years. But if we put them in a situation where they have a 4-foot hell strip between the sidewalk and the street, and it's in a utility access where there's trenching and things going through and there's compaction, we're doing a lot of things that are really hard on our trees. And that's not to say that oaks are not going to be a suitable street tree, because in a lot of cases they very much can be. But for me, I want to think about opportunities to what can we do to make that planting site better, either through practices we have for root protection zones around it, for some zoning and planning things we can do to help create areas that are better suited for these trees to go into, for encouraging people to plant these trees, not just between the sidewalk and the street, but maybe have that front yard space be better engaged for a large tree. Or, something that we've done. So I live in a town of 400 people in the middle of Flint Hills, not a big town, no resources, nothing. So as unsurprisingly, I got involved because I want to plant more trees in the park years ago, because we don't have a lot of suitable like street tree planting spaces in our town. Pretty good canopy cover, but not a lot of opportunities to really move that into better, canopy diversity until we have more trees come out. But what we can do in the park is plant trees in a different way than we plant street trees, right? For street trees, you need to have clearance, right? You need to prune those things up to a point where you can get people walking under, semi trucks driving under them. You need to have spacing. In a park, do we need to have trees that are all 50 foot on center and pruned up to 20 feet? Probably not. I'm not driving a semi through the city park. So we have opportunities to do things like plant trees in community, right? Trees can touch, right? It's okay for trees to touch. They can be planted 10 feet apart and it's not going to be the end of the world. Even large maturing trees can be planted in groves. In fact, Doug talks about that in his book. When I read that, I was like, yes, right on. We've been talking about this for a while, right? Trees can touch. Additionally, we can diversify not just our species that we have, but we can diversify spatially, right? So we have an overstory, an understory, mid-story, ground level. So sometimes people say, I don't want to plant burr oak because I don't want to, kick over all those acorns. They fall in my grass and I mow them. I say, well, the easy solution is quit mowing under the tree. Plant some understory plants under there, right? I mean, that's what I did. I've got in my side yard by my house, I've got a couple large trees. One's a pecan, one's a black walnut. My wife jokes we bought that house not for the house, but it already had good trees on the property. But under those trees, we've planted a mid-story of things like Eastern Wahoo and pawpaw and some what I call Texas buckeye. Some people might call it the Kansas, eco type of Ohio buckeye. But you plant some mid-story plants in there, and then you have an understory where I don't mow under there. Maybe it's because I'm lazy. Maybe it's because I'm a really, progressive ecologist or something. Really because I'm lazy and I like plants, but I don't mow under there. So I've got all kinds of spring ephemeral stuff that's growing under there. I've got some sedges. I've got some, what else do I have in there? Iris cristata, this dwarf woodland iris, all kinds of crazy stuff in there that we just keep sticking in, partially because I've never once seen a plant that I couldn't somehow shoehorn onto my place. My wife is a horticulturist as well, so we're really in trouble. We got way too many plants on our place. But really what we're doing there is we're building this like, complex, multi-story, plant diversity that has something happening all season, which is fun to watch, but it also has tons of support for all the different types of stuff that's going on there. All those critters that love living in leaf litter that will pupate here or be an adult here. There's huge amounts of opportunity there that I think gets to be where you have bigger ecosystem benefit, better things for the trees, more long-lasting life for those trees. And there's a lot more interest. And yeah, in public parks, sometimes you have to consider, do you have areas that are going to be potentially, collecting litter, or people, I always hear about, people that are going to hide in the shrubs, the weirdos that hide in the shrubs and look at kids, or I don't know. I've heard this over and over. So you need to have some sight lines and some security stuff. That's totally reasonable to expect. But I think there's opportunities where we don't have to manage all of our spaces in our community as if every one of those is a street tree that has to be, on compacted ground and mow around and you can drive semis under. So really long way of saying, yeah, maybe those trees needed to come out, but maybe there's other places in your community that you can build those sorts of, groves of multiple trees that you can really maximize the lifespan of those trees. And you can maximize that small island of ecosystem services and pollinator support and insect food web support, all that kind of cool stuff that can happen on even something as small as, a few hundred square feet, as opposed to individual street trees.
That's great. So I want to make sure that we have some solid, this is great oak tree discussion, so no need to pivot off of it, but some solid time to talk about the book. And kind of my first burning question, I'm completely surrounded by oak trees in the city. My front yard trees an oak, my backyard trees an oak. I don't have anything else. And all of my neighbors have oaks. So in spite of being wrapped around oaks, I don't know that I had spent a lot of time thinking specifically about those trees. So my question to all of you is, I feel like after I read this, I kind of put oaks on a pedestal, but how did you feel about them before you started? Obviously, Ryan was an enthusiast, but had any of you really thought about them being a keystone species or being perhaps more valuable than some of our other more common species?
Yeah.
You had?
Yeah, no, well, Ariel, that I'm crazy about pollinators. And so I already knew that caterpillars love oaks. And so they support so many, different kinds of pollinators. And then, like we talked about already, that cascades into, you don't have a lot of soft-bodied insects, your bird population suffers, and and so on. But but I've always just loved oak trees. There's such a diversity of them, and we got some really beautiful oak trees that grow here in Northeast Kansas. You can see my favorite behind me, Chinkapin oak. What an awesome tree. They're beautiful year round. I mean, they're like the perfect oak for multi-seasonal interest. Even after they drop their leaves, they have such an interesting branching pattern. I just love looking at them.
They've got character.
Yes, they do. They do. Very interesting bark, but that's just one example. I mean, bur oaks, what an awesome tree. You were talking about how the fire resistant. I was out at Konza Prairie here recently and was going through the bottomland there, and there was this gigantic bur oak that was all charred around the base, that had already, been survived some pretty serious fire. And I was just like looking at that thing and marveling how it could be so scorched and everything around the trunk of that tree and still just be this gigantic thriving, specimen out there.
That's great, Kevin.
Yeah, I might just jump in real quick and say that I love oaks, that's clear, right? But I think it's also important to think about this on its flip side too. And we also can't only have oaks, right? So you were talking about your neighborhood, Ariel, of so many oaks. Like, I think it's super important to have oaks be part of our systems, but we can't do that to the exclusion of everything else too, because there's like, you talk about the prunus genus, like all of our cherries and plums and stuff, they do massive, incredible things for stuff too. And yeah, even though I'm a forester by trade, like having the other components of our systems out there, having, tall grass prairie is so important, especially for our part of the world, but we can't have the exclusion of, other things just because one thing is the most important part. And actually, I was encouraged even in Doug's book, and in one point he says here, he says in most US counties, oaks, we know he's going to say oaks, but cherries, willows, birches, hickories, pines, and maples are producing the vast numbers and types of insects that support all the animal populations. So like, it's a really, really important piece of the puzzle, right? Keystone, we keep talking about keystone. We really want to have it in there. But the way it interplays and works alongside of all these other woody species, all these other herbaceous species, all these other systems is really cool to watch. So yeah, oak's number one, but like there's a whole other list of stuff we want to have out there too.
Well, and like you were talking about, Ryan, in your yard, how you have those understory trees, right? Like buckeye, pawpaw. I mean, you're naming them off, and I'm like, oh yeah, pawpaw, zebra, swallowtail. I mean,
Yep.
right? So just like Doug talks about in his book, there's, you have these generalist type of insects, but then you also have pollinators that are real specialists. And so, having those other, I mean, pawpaw is a great example. If you want to have zebra swallowtails in your home ecosystem, you better be planting a couple pawpaws out there. Yeah, so yeah, I mean, they're kind of sort of like a, I guess kind of a anchor that you can build off of.
Mary, you were unmuted. Did you have something you wanted to add?
Sure. So I too am a master gardener. So, hey, Kevin. And one of the things I've noted as, I started the Master Gardener program in 2016, and this is a funny statement, but since I've been a master gardener, I've had more insects. And the reality is I've only started to notice the insects. It doesn't mean that I have more insects. It just means that I'm looking for them. And, I have a lovely birch tree and an ash tree and in the backyard, and I've noted the little strands of the inchworm coming down and all those just magnificent things. And I guess to me, Doug Talamay's book is kind of a love letter to insects. And when I went out front to my massive pin oaks, and there was a limb that had blown off, and I literally picked it up and I'm like peeling it apart, going, is anybody in there? I mean, is anybody in this particular piece? There was lichen all over it. And I'm like, I know there was one particular moth that he talked about that looks just like a lichen. And I'm like flipping through it, like touching it, going, no, there's not one on, but it's December. So, everybody's pretty quiet at this point in time, but it has just given me such an appreciation of, I knew monarchs and swallowtails, but I didn't know blue. I mean, all these, it's the Doug Talamay insect wrap that he goes through. And I'm now looking for him. And, he listed 500 and I've maybe seen 5. So I'm now looking for, 495 more. So that's what I really appreciate about his book and all the information that he puts in there.
Yeah.
Maybe we could start a bingo card, Mary, and we could all just check off,
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah. So something Mary just said there is, looking for stuff in December, and something Kevin talked about before too. And in terms of like the dormant season, Chincoman oak still having all this interest to them. I love that Doug organized his book like this. Like, here's some things you can see every month, because so often we fall into this hole of you walk into the garden center, what looks good now, what's going to have flowers on it for a week, maybe a day in the spring before they blow away. Listen, it's windy here. Those flowers aren't going to last. And then we got this tree. We've made a landscape choice, a permanent, well, more or less permanent landscape choice based on this ephemeral, maybe it has flowers one time. But I think if you take the time to look, there's fascinating stuff to see on our trees year round. So why are we making this choice based on maybe the 1 week that's most showy? And I would say, shoot, oaks can still be showy. I mean, whoever's seen a white oak in the fall, man, there's no better fall color than a white oak that's just going nuts in about, late September or October. That purple is a color that just occurs nowhere else in nature. But, we have stuff to see all the time. Pick up a twig and look at it, look at the bark in the wintertime, look at, those crazy little nut hatches going upside down, all up and down the bark, hiding stuff in there. All kinds of cool stuff year round. And, there's some easy examples like, the bark interest of sycamores or paper birch in the winter. But, I think if you just take the time to look, you could see something, shoot, not just every month, every week, you could probably see something different on your tree. And I think it'd be cool to keep a journal, keep a count, keep a bingo card of all the stuff you see.
Absolutely. And one thing Mary said that I want to touch on, and then I want to read a couple of the comments in the chat. In my time in Extension, I was the horticulture agent in Shawnee County. God, and Kevin can speak to this because he's a volunteer there. And all of you that have worked response lines across the state, I'm sure see the same thing. Homeowners bringing in something that's killing their tree and they want to obliterate it. I mean, drop a nuclear bomb on this plant and they don't even know what it is. And so I really love that Doug, being an entomologist, centered this around, hey, look at how freaking cool it is that this caterpillar has, overcome all these obstacles and is eating this leaf. That's a big deal. But also the tree's fine. It's being eaten by all these different species and they've co-adapted together. And with the exception of invasive species, they're good. They're kind of running side by side. So I really appreciated his take. I hope that people that aren't horticulturalists, that aren't foresters, are reading this book and going, oh, not just with oaks, but with a lot of things, maybe I don't have to sweat every bug.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, Ariel, how many times did people come in to response line and with, what are these weird bumps on my oak leaves?
Every day.
Freaking out about some kind of gall. Don't sweat it,
Yeah.
And I mean, I love the way he organized his book. I'm going to get a copy for our Master Gardener library because it's organized by month. People bring something in and it's like, you're looking at it, it's like, okay, this is something that's happening on an oak tree, but I'm not familiar with it. You can flip his book open, go to the month and be like, oh, okay, that's some little insect I didn't know about. When I first started reading it, one of the first things that he was talking about in there was those acorn weevils,
Yes.
And I've had people just freak out. It's like, what's drilling all these holes in my acorns? It's like, it's okay. They're good. They're doing good stuff. They're not going to kill all your acorns.
So I've been banned from storing acorns in my fridge at home because I have done that. And then acorn weevils don't just come out of the acorn. They also come through the plastic bag you put it in. And I can tell you, even though, again, my wife is a horticulturist, she doesn't like leave acorn weevil larvae in the bottom of the fridge we keep our food in. So I can't keep acorns in our fridge at home anymore.
Yeah, nobody wants to see that. Okay, let me read a couple of the comments in the chat because those people have been waiting. Joan says, chinkapin is my favorite, but oaks aren't listed as a keystone species here in Sedgwick County, but she just loves oaks in general. And then Crystal shared that in older neighborhoods, the oaks are outliving other species, especially maples. I see that a lot in our neighborhoods, which makes it really important to keep planting those other species as well. And then Sheena says, yes, I think organizing the chapters by month, it really helps to connect people to the idea that life changes over the season. There's not just an on off. That's a great point because I think people think like spring, fall, and that's it. And then Mary said, Doug's 10 to 40 rule is great. You can see the damage at 10 feet, but step back 40 feet and it is fine. And that's a really good perspective as well. Like Mary was saying, when the branch fell down, she was able to see the insect, but my oaks are so mature. There could be 10,000 caterpillars up there. I'm never going to see that. Those leaves are so high up. So just kind of let them be. Great discussion. I want to see if I can slip in another question. I realize that most of us on here probably already have overplanted yards. Ryan already admitted it. I refuse to admit it. I've only been in my house for 5 years, so I haven't reached my limit. Did anybody plant an oak? Is anybody going to plant an oak? Or did this just make you think, like I'm thinking about my oaks, that I need to get more understory species under there? So has this changed the way you're thinking about your property, or if you're a municipality thinking about your plan? Did this change anything for any of you, or are we all just already gung ho? Oh, Sheena's been collecting acorns. That's great.
I think listening to Ryan talk about the dwarf chinkapins, like we don't really have any the understory oaks and things out in Southwest Kansas, and that's part of like my comment earlier about even though they're a large tree, they're not going to fall on your house. Southwest Kansas, we had 60-mile-an-hour winds just a couple of days ago. That's normal. So trees get big, people freak out, they're going to fall on my house. Well, the oak's not going to do that until after you're gone.
Yeah.
So then talking to Ryan and finding these things out, like about the dwarf chinkapin, that's something I want to do. I want to come get some acorns. I want to try growing them. I want to get them growing in Dodge City, because if we get them going in the parks and they're surviving, then I can collect more acorns and I don't have to drive halfway across the state to get acorns. I'll have them here. So
Yeah, I think we'll talk offline sometime too, Chris, but I think there's actually a lot of really cool options that you can look to. Actually look just southwest of you, northeast New Mexico. There's some really cool stuff growing that I think would actually be really well adapted for you. So yeah, I got a plan for you. There's a lot of cool options that I think you can do.
okay, that's perfect. I've got some stuff to email you.
I can see we're going to have an acorn collecting party at some point. Like that's
For
going to have to
sure.
be the second.
For sure. Yeah. So I planted a chinkapin oak in my backyard, but I've been wanting to plant more, and I was like, I don't really have room, and then talking about those dwarf chinkapin oaks, I'm like, oh yeah, I can definitely do that. So I'm coming for some of those acorns. But you know what, Chris, I wonder how blackjack oak would do out in your neck of the woods. That's a nice little another smaller oak, and I think they're really a neat
So
tree.
I've talked to Tim McDonald about those multiple times, and probably 10 or 15, not 15, I've only been here 12 years. So 10 or 8 years ago, I ordered some online and I grew them to about a foot and a half, and they did not survive. I don't have a greenhouse at this time, so that's kind of hard to struggle with, like keeping them alive in the wintertime. I want blackjacks really bad. So every year I look on eBay and it's just iffy. And I, like Ryan, have had multiple acorn weevils in my refrigerator, and people who live with me aren't really, fans of that, but it happens. So, but yes, I would love the blackjacks if I could find them.
Those weevils are a great source of protein. Just throw that out there.
I love watching them when they come out, and the same thing with like bullet gulls. I love cutting open bullet gulls and seeing the little bugs in there. I mean, I don't know, it's just fun to do.
Definitely. So we have a couple of really good questions in the chat. One is about early in the book, there's a comment about people avoiding oaks around homes because of a concern about damaging the sidewalk, the house, etc. Talame indicated that these concerns are overstated. I've heard comments about tree roots getting in sewer lines and drain tile. Are there observations about whether oaks are likely to cause problems with basement foundations and drain tile? And I'll just open that up to the group.
My quick reaction is often it's not the tree's fault that you've got a bigger problem. If you've got leaky sewer lines, if you've got a basement that has, perched water against it or something, often the tree is exploiting a problem that already exists that needs to be addressed. Or if you plant a tree 3 feet away from a sidewalk, what do you expect? I mean, you're kind of setting it up for failure there. That's like putting a stick in the spokes of your bike and being like, this dang bike.
Well, and I'll mention to a lot of people in our city that the roots follow the path of least resistance, just like water does. So anytime you've had soil disturbances and the root can get into that, like so where anywhere that pipes have been laid, anywhere they've dug to lay in sidewalks and things like that, and that soil's not as compacted as it has been for years and years and years, the roots are going to follow those tunnels. So, and that's right where we lay our pipes.
Mhm.
Yeah, here in my neighborhood, it's an older part of Topeka, and it's all, you know, the sewer lines are like over 70 years old, and it's all that old clay tile. It's like, I'm telling you, you get one little crack in there, and especially with the dry uh weather we've been having. Boy, a little tree root is like, I sense some water over there, and the next thing, wow, you got roots in that pipe. That's just what trees do.
And I
Doesn't
don't think
matter if
that's
it's an oak
unique.
tree.
Right. I don't think that's unique to oak trees. I don't think that I have not seen anything that indicates that oaks are going to damage anything more than other large species. Definitely the size of the species would matter. It was definitely a concern that we had. We probably have a 100-year-old oak behind our 100-year-old house. I imagine that they came in existence around the same time, but it was there, and we just do our best. The big concern with me moving forward is when we're making renovations to our 100-year-old house, those tree roots. Somebody wanted to drive a bobcat over it to fix our porch, and I was like, if the porch falls off, that's okay. Like, so I think just being mindful with our urban trees of what you're doing, because most likely it's us that are making the problem worse. Another good question we had in the chat was about tree canopies on city property. She said in Wichita, there's a problem with vandalism by mowers and weed whips used by contracted groundkeepers. I do not think that that's unique to Wichita. I think that that's a good example of an opportunity for some education, either by the city or by the municipality for whoever they're contracting, which unfortunately, again, is usually a lowest bidder.
And there's a sort of a structural maintenance thing you can do to change that too, right? What do you weed whip? You weed whip weeds and grass. Well, what if you don't have to have, what if you have a big mulch bed? What if you have understory under that? There's opportunities to sort of change your management regime. And I fully understand and respect that not every city has the same capabilities to do some of these things. And sometimes the wind blows 60 miles an hour, and not a lot of mulch stays put when wind's blowing 60 miles an hour. I totally respect that. But I think if you pull back and think about what can we do so that you don't have to have that conflict there's lots of opportunities. Or there's things you can do, like I sometimes drive T-posts next to trees I plant. I'm not tying the tree to that T-post. I'm just making it so the lawnmower jockey has to run over my T-post first before he runs over my tree.
Well, that, the stuff that Mary was talking about, what we're just talking about here. One thing that I found in our community is policymakers, for the most part, I'm not saying all of them, but for the most part, they have no clue about what the benefits are of a healthy urban forest. I'm not just talking about, oaks being keystone species, but, cuts down on erosion, water quality, addressing urban heat island issues in low income neighborhoods where people don't have air conditioners. The shade helps, improve that neighborhood. There's just, I could go on, but we have a lot of work to do with educating people that make the big decisions in our cities, to educate them about the importance of a healthy urban tree canopy.
Yeah, and I would guess you'd probably agree with me on this, Kevin, is I don't think people are arbitrarily making bad decisions they know are harmful, right? There's just, if you realize the benefits, people make rational decisions, right? So as you can help educate policymakers and decision makers on the benefits of maintaining this or choosing this course, then often, you get good buy-in. You say, well, yeah, I can see how that is a better decision to make. But it can be a tough row to hoe on that too, because there's a lot of other competing interests and things that have got to balance. So I understand that, but I have been encouraged where I've seen people sort of have that eye-opening moment. They go, oh, I understand, green infrastructure is the buzzword around it, but when you understand the multiple benefits of having robust green infrastructure, often people go, oh, yeah, I can see how we can support these things now.
Well, and particularly if you can educate them on the economic benefits, policymakers, they always, when they see the dollar signs, are like, oh, okay, I'm for it.
There's some good data out there that, you can take the Chamber of Commerce that shows, increase in spending in downtown districts that have good canopy cover.
Mhm.
That's robust data. that says, these things are good for multiple benefits, not just because it's pretty, but, there's a likelihood that people may spend more money in your shopping district if there's a nice canopy there. That's compelling.
Yeah.
And that was a big push. I'm glad that you brought that statistic up. There's statistics about green spaces decreasing gun violence, about increasing senses of community, increasing mental health. So tons of really good benefits. And that was a big push for our community tree canopy assessment. And I'm going to put that link in the chat right now. But all of the incorporated cities in Kansas received this information. Our community foresters, however, don't always have a strong contact in every community. So sometimes it's the city clerk and the mayor, and we're just saying, gee, I hope somebody, takes this. So if you're in a community where you feel like trees aren't being supported, or you want to have better information about that, definitely use that link I sent earlier to connect with your community forester, but also reach out to your city and make sure that this isn't information, this tree canopy information isn't being pushed to the back burner, that it's something that they're utilizing, that it's something that they're thinking about, because we're seeing that most of our communities don't have the tree canopy that they should, that they want to, and they may not be aware of those changes. So I think that's a really good resource. We are just at 1 o'clock. Are there this has been such a good discussion. I got through 2 of my questions, which was the exact number that I thought I was going to get to, but that's great because so many of you had great points. I don't want to skip over Tim's question. So be thinking about maybe a last wrap up question that anybody else has, but Tim has germinated acorns, but he's having trouble getting them to thrive in the 2nd or 3rd year. Does anybody have some experience with that or insight?
I might just jump in and say that, we know that oaks preferentially are allocating resources to their roots in the first 2 years of growth before they have any top growth. So I think it's really important to make sure that whether you're putting them in the ground or in a container, we're sort of thinking about where that growth is going to be. It's going to be in the roots, and we need to protect that root zone, protect it from compaction, protect it from drying out. If you're growing in a container for a really long time, protect it from getting root bound. If you're growing in, just like a little flower pot, you're going to want something that has more root space for that tree. And then also that top growth, especially the first couple of years, is going to be really delectable for rabbits and other stuff to come along and nip off. So it could be a challenge. I've even had trees that a squirrel comes along and pulls the acorn out if it's still attached to the seedling and pulls the whole thing up. But if you start to think about, what's this tree trying to do? It's trying to, get up, get some sunlight, get those first few set of leaves, and then it's going to prioritize all of its growth into the roots. So I really need to focus on the roots, not the top. That might help with some success in container selection and how much you water and all that kind of stuff. One thing I would say is don't over fertilize it. One of the biggest mistakes people often make when they're trying to grow acorns or other little trees is they're going to hit that thing with a lot of fertilizer, like they're growing a tomato or an annual or something. And that can often have, worse outcomes than in the first place.
And I don't know if Ryan will agree with me or not, but all of mine I've grown in like rooter pots or rooter bags. So that way you get more of that fibrous root mass than your structural roots for the first 1 or 2 years. What he mentioned, my issues have been the squirrels and the rabbits just eating them, or as it moves through the wintertime, myself forgetting to go out and water them at least once a month. So try the rooter bags, try the rooter pots. I seem to have really good luck with those. And you're basically just flipping them inside out or cutting them off when you go to plant them at the beginning of that 3rd spring or that 2nd fall. And I've had great success with that.
Yeah, if you want to go deep down the rabbit hole on that, you can Google Dr. Carl Whitcomb and some of the air pruning containers that he developed. And then I'm not advocating for any particular manufacturer or anything, but that'll get you started on that whole rabbit hole, thinking about air pruning and pruning roots with a container to produce that fibrous, well-branched root system. Because again, most traditional nursery production is set up for maples and elms, which naturally have fibrous, shallow root systems. They're basically just set up to take the abuse that a normal nursery can would put them in. And oaks and hickories and other things are just not as well. So yeah, if you just Google air pruning root containers or Dr. Carl Whitcomb, he was a researcher at Oklahoma State, you'll get all kinds of good information that will sort of start to get those gears turning about what can I do in a container that's going to suit this tree species.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for weighing in. I'm going to go ahead and put our post survey link in the chat, but I am going to post this recording to YouTube and I will send it out to all of you as soon as it's ready. Along with that, there were some assorted, wonderful questions in the registration, including pocket gophers and recommended trees and climate change. Really good stuff, especially pocket gophers, because I had to remember what's the difference between a pocket gopher and a prairie dog, but I read about it and I figured it out. So I am going to include all those resource links in the summary that I send out to you all. So don't think that we aren't answering your question if you asked something that was a little bit different. I'm sorry we couldn't have more discussion, but I so appreciate all of you getting on with us today. We have not picked another book. We're looking at doing one every quarter, so probably looking at something in March. So if you have something you're interested in, something you would love for us to discuss, I think this was really great. And this is something we would like to continue. So please fill out that survey. Let us know what you think. And thank you all so much for being on with us today.
Yeah, this was fun. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, loved it. Yeah, thanks for putting it together, guys.
Bye, guys.
Bye.